What is love? Baby, don't hurt me. Don't hurt me no more.
KFI AM640. You are listening to Dr. Wendy Walsh. This is the Dr. Wendy Walsh Show. So, there's a lot of talk worldwide about female genital mutilation. We just gasp when we think of the millions of babies and little girls around the world who have their clitoris and often parts of their labia brutally cut off, sometimes parts of their vagina sewn together to prevent male, gaining access. They have sexual dysfunction problems because of it. They may have bladder and urinary problems because of it. We are all aghast. In fact, there's a movement around the world to stop this barbaric, cultural, for no medical reason, mutilation of baby girls' bodies. And on the same day that we say that and carry signs, tweet about it, we take our own babies to the hospital. And when they're male, or when they're born in the hospital, have their genitals mutilated. And somehow it's okay. My next guest is the founder and director of an organization called Intaction, inaction.org. He founded the organization because he wanted to give children a voice over the autonomy of their own bodies. And he wanted to raise awareness of just having an intact body and how important that is. He did something very brave. He went back decades to something that happened decades earlier. And he tracked down the obstetrician who circumcised him decades earlier.
He remembered my family. He remembered my parents quite distinctly. He remembered me and my brother. And I asked him what it was like to tie me down and cut off part of my body. I asked him how it made him feel. And he didn't have any response. I asked him, was I screaming when he did it? Did I scream? And he didn't have any response. And I asked him, did he have my consent to do it?
Welcome, my guest, Anthony Losquadro, founder and director of inaction.org. Hi, Anthony.
Hi, Dr. Walsh. Thanks for having me on the air.
Wow, that was a powerful bit of audio there. Why did you do it? Why did you go back and find that obstetrician who circumcised you?
Yeah, first, I want to say our organization is called Intaction.org,
okay.
Intation.
Thank you.
And that video was taken when I was at a conference in Finland on genital autonomy. And I felt it was important. This was a while ago that I contacted this obstetrician. I don't know that he's still around anymore. Matter of fact, I kind of doubt it. But I felt it was important to me to speak to him. I needed to hear the voice of the person that tied me down and cut off part of my genitals, and I wanted some answers. And, you read about this issue. I'm sure your listeners have read about this issue in the news or online, and everyone's great at debating this. But when I asked this doctor what was the reason why he did this, he told me he didn't have an answer. He had no answers. And the more I researched circumcision, and whether you want to call it circumcision, or you want to call it genital cutting or genital mutilation, it's all the same thing. When it gets down to it, there is no reason for doing it. That's what I found. And that's why one of the reasons I founded Intaction was to try to make other people aware of these issues and share some of the things that I've learned.
Let's set up the problem. How many boys, newborn boys, are currently being circumcised in America? And has that number been going down at all?
The number's been going down, fortunately, slowly. The rate is probably around 55%. The last data we have from the CDC was around 2012, so it's very dated.
Compared to, say, the 1970s when it was almost 100%, I'm sure, right?
Yeah, it was up in the 80s, up in the high 80s, and maybe even 90% back then. So it's been dropping down. That's fortunate. But you have to realize that still means about 1 million baby boys every year in America. And this is an American phenomenon. So I want your listeners to understand this. This is really outside of people of Jewish faith and Muslim faith around the world. This is a unique American phenomenon.
Even in Canada, the Canadian Pediatric Association has been educating parents for the last couple decades. The rates are down around 30% in Canada because of that.
Yet not only that, the Canadian Pediatric Society issued a do not recommend circumcision policy statement about 2 years ago. So they're instructing their doctors not to recommend it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So
unlike the American Pediatric Association, which in 2012 put out a paper recommending it?
Well, it was more positive circumcision than negative, but they didn't really recommend it, but they said that parents should maintain a choice. But more importantly, they said that insurance companies should continue to pay for it. You have to understand, first of all, the AAP is a lobbying trade association. It's not really... It's more of that. It's more about protecting doctors' insurance reimbursements than it is for advocating for children's health. And they were more concerned about insurance payments than anything else.
Amazing that insurance will pay to have male genitals cut, and they won't pay for menopausal women to have vaginal rejuvenation. Amazing.
They started becoming nervous, I think, because over 16 states have dropped coverage under Medicaid for circumcision, for infant circumcision. So I think they maybe felt that their reimbursements were under threat. So they issued a new policy statement, which they flip-flopped. They flip-flopped about 6 times over the last several decades. They said recommend it, then they said don't recommend it, and they said recommend it, and then they said don't recommend it, and now they said insurance, make sure insurance pays for it. So that credibility is really a used car salesman has more credibility than they do.
I want to talk about two things separately. One is the physical dangers of male circumcision, and the other are the mental health dangers. Let's start with just the physical. Is it dangerous? Can it be?
There are significant risks to circumcision. First of all, the actual procedure is not really taught in medical school. It's on-the-job training. What doctors like to say is see one, do one, teach one. That's their motto. Okay, so your son's not being circumcised if someone was to choose that by a person that's been highly trained in doing it. It's probably a resident or a physician's assistant. They line up all the babies in a little bit of an assembly line, timed down to these circumstraint contractions, so they're spread eagle, and they put this clamp on their penis, which crushes the foreskin, and it's about a 15-minute procedure where the child is usually screaming in agony. And I want to point out that little to no anesthesia is given because babies really can't tolerate the anesthesia that an adult would have.
And there are the risks of infection or a botched circumcision where they may have, damage to their penis.
There's very significant risk, and things do go wrong. A recent study out of Utah found an 11.5% serious complication rate. Another study out of Denmark found that around 26% of babies that are circumcised usually have a complication later on called stenosis, which is a narrowing of the urethra or the tube that you urinate from, and it requires further surgeries down the road to correct that. So, and then there are more serious complications. I've assisted in some legal cases. There's a case in New York where the same doctor severely botched 2 babies in a row using a device known as a Mogen clamp. Companies been put out of business for malpractice claims, but this device continues to be used by hospitals. And what happens if it's done improperly, and it's very common, is the tip of the penis gets cut off. Happened to babies in New York. It happened to a lady down in Georgia named Stacey Willis. I was also assisted with that case. Mother received a $33 million judgment because not only the doctors botched her son, They wrapped him up, told him, take him home, he's fine. And when she got home, the baby wouldn't stop bleeding.
Oh.
She had to take him to the emergency room, and they tried to cover it up and sweep it under the rug.
Oh, my goodness. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have to go to a break. Anthony, can you stay with us for another segment?
Absolutely.
I'm talking to Anthony Losquadro, the founder and director of Intaction.org. We are talking male circumcision. You're listening to the Dr. Wendy Walsh Show on KFI AM640. Rocio Rivera has the news for us.
A brush fire is burning near the 134 freeway near the border of
No more.
KFI AM640. You have Dr. Wendy Walsh with you. I am with my guest, Anthony Losquadro, founder of and director of Intaction. Keeping it intact, get it? Intaction.org. An organization that gives children a voice over their body autonomy and raise awareness of the importance of keeping an intact body and the dangers of male circumcision. Anthony, let's talk about the mental health dangers of circumcising your male child.
Well, there's two stages of this. There's the pain and trauma that affects the infant, because, like I said earlier, there's little to no anesthesia given to babies. So the pain, the foreskin is basically crushed. They have to crush it in order to prevent it from bleeding. So this is a 15-minute procedure. The babies often scream throughout it. Some babies vomit. Some babies exhibit seizure-like effects or symptoms, so much to the point that I had a neurodiagnostic technician from Cedars-Sinai tell me once that babies are often sent to her after circumcision because the doctors are worried that the baby's having a seizure. And they do a brain study on the baby, and they find no structural abnormalities, but it was the pain from the circumcision was actually causing these symptoms, which is like eyes rolling back in the head, difficulty breathing.
Because of spikes in cortisol and other neurotransmitters. But let me also say that there is, as a psychologist, I can tell you that people love to dismiss things that children don't have a primary memory of, right? And so they'll say, oh, they won't remember it. They won't remember. The truth is, trauma that happens when you are pre-verbal actually gets stored in your bones as feeling that you can't make sense of because you can't, talk it out in therapy because you don't remember it. You just know that something bad happened.
That's such a common thing we hear from people, a misperception. They say, well, the babies can't remember it. And just because a child or a baby can't remember something, that doesn't mean that they're not affected by it. This affects their hippocampus in their brain, which is the area that's responsible for long-term memory. And fear becomes imprinted in their brain almost.
And now there's this movement of men who were circumcised when they were babies, to start to speak out with feelings of anger and sadness. Talk about this movement.
Well, guys later on in life, when they look into this and they find out what was done to them, you may grow up wondering, they may grow up wondering why they have a scar on their penis, and, I don't have a scar anywhere else on my body. Where did this come from? And there's a sense of betrayal sometimes from their parents that, how could my mother or my father let this happen to me? This is, the natural body that they were endowed with by nature. And someone went in, a parent took it upon themselves to have their child's genitals cut because the parent wanted to do it. It's not like the child said, I wanted this, or an adult said, I want this. The parents wanted this for their son, even though they never were able to ask their son for consent. And, it's interesting in this era, I just want to bring this up, in this era of Me Too and toxic masculinity. And how do we expect young men or men in general to respect a woman's body and a woman's autonomy and a woman's space when their own body and their own autonomy and their own space wasn't respected at all when they were born into this world?
Exactly. I'm sure you're quite familiar with a kind of parallel movement that people who are born nowadays with ambiguous genitalia, whereas, 20, 30, 40 years ago, doctors and parents made a decision looking at ambiguous external genitalia and just cut and snipped, and parents kind of chose a gender, and then they didn't know that there might have been undescended testes or ovaries that were there, and then they chose a gender, and then when puberty happened, everything changed, and there was a lot of identity crisis, gender dysmorphia among these individuals. And so in the same way, let's look at babies who are born anatomically, I'm making quotation marks with my fingers, correct or normal, and then why do we mutilate them? Is there some sort of strength and power you're feeling because of this additional movement of people with ambiguous genitalia?
The intersex movement is part of our overall movement. And, it's just, sometimes a baby's born with ambiguous genitalia and the parents or the doctors pick a gender, and usually the results are disastrous. Mm-hmm. So, because when that individual grows up, if the parents decide they're going to make them a male and the person really wants to be a female, it's the conventional wisdom these days is to leave the child alone. When they mature, they can pick for themselves who they want to be, or
they can just be a person. Amazing. I want to close by saying, it's in some ways, it's helpful for parents to understand the dangers of circumcision. But I like to point out the positives of the uncircumcised penis. Can you tell a few, or should I?
You were reading my mind. I'm so glad you brought this up, because there are some great things to talk about. The foreskin is an amazing body part. We call it. We say that it has the four powers of foreskin. That is, it provides pleasure, it provides protection, it provides lubrication, and it provides connection. Nature put this on our body for a reason. And incidentally, women also have a foreskin in the form of the clitoral hood. So nature put this on our bodies for a reason. It's in our DNA. We were meant to have it. It serves an important function. And 22 medical associations around the world specifically do not recommend circumcision. Most of the world is intact. Like I said earlier, this is a unique American phenomenon that started about 100 years ago, and it turned into a big business.
And ladies and gentlemen listening, parents out there, the uncircumcised penis has been shown to have more nerve endings and experience more pleasure during sex. So
absolutely. There's 20,000 nerve endings in the foreskin, and we like to call it the intact penis. It's okay. The intact penis.
The intact penis. Thank you so much for being with us. Anthony Losquadro, you can find him at intaction.org. That's INTACTION.org. Thank you so much for being with us.
Dr. Wendy, thank you so much for having me on your show.
My pleasure. We'll talk to you soon.